Hello, this is Friendly Cat, and this is a complete guide to Resistance and Garrisons and Hearts and Iron 4. This channel and I focus on achievement runs, single-player achievement runs, particularly the most difficult achievement runs. So in this guide, I'll actually be showing an actual run. This is an Afghanistan run, and what templates and garrisons I used as we explain the different concepts. The first part of this guide is just going to show you what templates and what laws to use, when to use them. I know a lot of you folks don't have a lot of time, so I'll just get right to that. The second part will go into the mechanics of resistance. I strongly suggest, whether you have 5 hours or 5,000 hours, take a time to review how the mechanics work, because that will help us when we get into the third part, which is tips and tricks to really make the most of the system for your run. Particularly the most difficult single-player achievement runs. Afghanistan really isn't the most difficult, but Siberian Tiger, Makumai Day, there are a few others where you've got very low manpower and you'll need every bit of help you can get. Let's get into it. So part one is what garrisons do we use, what templates do we use, and what laws do we use. We're generally in the first few years of the run, maybe through 38 or so, you're very short on manpower, you're very short on infantry weapons, so we can't make fulfillment. So we're going to make a single heavy tank battalion. Then we're going to set the law to local police like I have here in Turkey. And then we're not going to make any heavy tanks. We're just going to let the resistance go. As you can see in resistance, it's all flared up into the 40% range. I don't care. We can't make the fulfillment with manpower. We can't make it with tanks. So we're just going to use the heavy tank and just let it go as an empty shell. Now eventually by 1938, 1939, we'll have enough manpower and infantry weapons that we can start thinking about making fulfillment. I'm going to use this template here. You could use a single cav if you'd like, but I prefer to fill it out and then add military police support company. And then for the resistance law, we're going to use the least, or the ones with the best compliance that gives us 10% or less resistance level. So in this run, for places like Iraq, we've got secret police, because that will eventually get us down to 10%. And Romania is on secret police. We've conquered them, we've annexed them. While for countries like Kuwait, which I'll be looking at, we'll be getting both the capitulated and exile resistance target, we're going to go martial law. And then if we get into Africa and we find countries that have like a 50% compliance, we can go as low as local police. But on your run, you're going to be able to see and then look when you select martial law. If that gets you down to 10% or less, that's good. But if secret police also does, you'll take secret police instead. Okay, so now you have all you know. You know what garrisons to use and you know what garrison laws to use. So we're going to move on to part two, which is the mechanics of resistance. And I really appreciate those who spend the time to listen through this, because it'll make a lot of sense when we get to tips and tricks. So the first thing we've got to keep in mind is that the Hearts of Fire developers do a lot of modeling or simulation. So I'm going to talk about how they simulate things as we go through this. So they simulate two types of land, core land and non-core land. So they say core land are people in general that speak your language, they share your culture of the government leadership. They're on board, they're okay to join the army if they need to, or the military. They'll make factories, and they're not going to blow things up. Those are your core folks. And then every other place is non-core. For pretty much all achievement runs, certainly the most difficult ones, you're going to have to spend a lot of time controlling non-core land. So the non-core land are the folks, they don't necessarily, again, speak your language or share your culture. They're not really on board. They don't feel like you have their interests in heart. And so some of them will form the resistance, will join the resistance. And when they join the resistance, they'll do things like blow up factories, sabotage resources, and worst of all, perhaps, eliminate your troops or your soldiers that are in the area. That's not very nice of them. But some of the people will join compliance. They'll be kind of like almost pseudo-core people, semi-core people. They're like, I've got on board. I'm going to, help make my factories even better, and I'm going to work hard, and I might even join the military more likely than I would otherwise. Well, that's great. We like as many of this. We like lots of compliance and very little resistance. Now there's a third type of entity which really isn't shown on this screen, but it's simulated as the people that haven't quite gone either direction yet. They're not really on board with the compliance. They don't really want to totally get on board with the new system, with the new government, but they're certainly not blowing up factories. So we want to kind of push those people toward compliance as well, but they're not actually shown on screen. Now the resistance folks, they do damage, and they've got some little levels. When they reach certain levels, they do lots of damage, and they can eventually, when they reach 90%, they'll actually have an uprising, or it looks like almost like a civil war, I think, in game, depending on where you are in the game. But they'll actually rise up and form their own little army or little soldiers, and they'll attack you, and you'll actually have to push them back down. So obviously we don't want that. Compliance has its own little bonuses too, but just for the most part, the higher the compliance, the more factories you're going to get in that land, and the more population as well, because I might mention that your core states give you 100% of the factories, but by default, non-core states give you 25%, but as compliance rises, you'll get a larger and larger percentage of the population that's available and the factories. Okay. So that's pretty cool. So now we know we want lots of compliance and we want low resistance. How do we get rid of that resistance? How do we deal with them? Well, this game simulates it by making garrisons. So one garrison is this. You can build a bunch of folks on horses and then give them some military police to help them out. And those folks will kind of keep things in check. They'll keep an eye on the resistance and, you know, hunt them down if they destroy factories or if they're causing trouble. You could also make heavy tanks. That's pretty cool. Heavy tanks give your troops some protection. And you could also make light tanks. On this game, in this road, I'm actually on the way to completing it. I haven't quite filled out this last row yet. I've got 4 more or 20 more army XP to spend, but this will eventually get filled out as well, so you can give them light tanks. You might say, well, how do I know which one's good and which one's not? Great question. Well, within the screen, the game will actually show you. So heavy tanks require 200 manpower per suppression point and 147 IC, but they have a 95 hardness. So this number we want as low as possible because we want as much, the lowest manpower per suppression, and we also want low IC, and then hardness reflects how much damage they'll take from the resistance. As you might imagine, the resistance wants to eliminate your folks, so if you're sending around in heavy tanks, then like most of the bullets are gonna, or the damage is gonna just bounce off, so you're not gonna take a lot of garrison losses. Cav requires about twice the manpower, which kind of makes sense. People and horses running around takes more than tanks, but only 24 IC. But that also makes sense. I mean, there are horses and people with guns, so it doesn't take as many factories. But they also have a 0 hardness, which means they will get they can get brutalized by resistance. They just don't have, I don't think they model bulletproof vests or anything like that, so they just get really beaten up pretty bad by high levels of resistance. And then there's light tanks, which is kind of in the middle. In this case, they've got part of a motorized police. That's why they're showing so much less manpower than heavy tank. And their IC is actually significantly less. Part of that is the motorized police, but partly it's just because light tanks take a lot less IC to make than heavy tanks. And their hardness is pretty darn good. It's not quite as good as heavy tanks, but it's pretty good. So you can use, these are just 3 samples, and obviously we'll be using these. This is what I'm using in this run, and I'll be showing you how I use them later on. But you can make infantry, and you can see these are the different models. These just happen to be other divisions that I've created for this game for my army, because you can use any army division and assign it to garrison duty up here. Well, of course, not only do we want to send troops, whether it's heavy tanks or infantry or cav, but we also want to set what's called the default law, and that really tells the local administrators how you want to deal with them. You can say no garrison, which basically says I'm not going to send any troops in there, just let that place go wild, and that will push resistance up 40%, and there'll be no compliance gain. In other words, this number is going to go really, really high resistance, and compliance is going to stay low, so that's no good. And as you look through the rest, you can kind of see they go in kind of incremental order, with civilian oversight being having the least positive effect on resistance, but also the least negative effect on compliance. So this is really good at drawing compliance, but the high resistance means your garrison is going to take a lot of damage. And then local police, they take less damage, but all less compliance. Secret police, even less damage, or lesser damage, but also even slower compliance. And then some of these ones down here, we're not going to spend too much time with them, but this is very low compliance gain, but in some cases they'll give you bonuses to factories and local resources. And in your run, you might use those. I can't think of a time I've used them in mine, because I tend to prefer a long-term compliance game, and a 0.08 0.10, that effectively means that compliance can be very, very low, and I want the compliance to gain over the course of the game to get more factories and more population over the long term. So that is the mechanics in a nutshell, in a really short trip. Now we're going to talk just a little bit more about how and which garrisons I'm using here in this run. So in this run, we started off in Afghanistan, we took Iran, then we took Turkey, and then since Romania guaranteed Turkey, we annexed Romania as well, and then we annexed Iraq when they went to war with the UK, and then now we're at war with the Allies, we're in the Axis, and we're moving our way through Syria and heading down toward the Suez. So at this game, we started off not being able to meet the fulfillment needs of Iran or Turkey. So Turkey and Iran looked like this: heavy tank with local police. Local police is the lowest fulfillment level at 65% of base, or minus 35%, and heavy tanks. But I wasn't building any heavy tanks, and I'm still not building any heavy tanks now. And then it looked like this. When I say look like this, I mean it looked like 40 plus, 45, maybe 50% resistance, and we just had to live with it. This is the most, the least painful way to expand as you expand out. If you cannot meet fulfillment. By the time we got into Romania, we actually managed to get enough manpower, enough infantry weapons that we could start to transition over to the cavalry, and that's what we're using here, because we really want to lock down resistance. If we can get resistance under 10 and keep it under 10, we're going to be in a good place. So that's what we've done here. We've got secret police, which is the least onerous, I guess the best available garrison law as far as compliance goes. That also keeps our resistance target at 10% or low. That we really want low resistance for fulfillment purposes. If we could do it with local police, we would. If we needed a martial law, we would. And as we look over to Iraq as well, Iraq actually, well, I've got fulfillment issues at the moment, but I think I can resolve those as I pick up a little bit more manpower. And so that will eventually drop down as well to 10% or less. And then as we look into Kuwait, Kuwait is actually on martial law, and right now the fulfillment is 0 because it's just coming on board, and I don't quite have the population yet, but I will get the population, and when we do, we'll bring this down to 10%. And it's on martial law because it's both capitulated and it's occupied, is in exile. It's got the exile and the capitulated resistance bonuses. So we want to put martial law, and that's the only way to keep them at 10% or less. And the same with Syria as well. Syria's on martial law. And it may seem odd, like, why am I using cavalry? Well, cavalry actually is the lowest IC cost. So it's the easiest way to keep an area at 10% or less. You might also be thinking, well, why don't you just put it on Turkey? Why don't you just put those cavalry on Turkey to get them down below? You've already got like a fair amount of compliance up there. Well, cavalry will get shredded at this level of this level of resistance. And that's because resistance fulfillment, if fulfillment in this case means the amount of garrisons you need to have in there, increases incrementally from 10% and higher. So for a resistance level between 0 and 10, it's the same level of fulfillment. But between 10 and 20, it's twice as high. And between 20 and 40, it's another twice double or increase. So this is 4 times the fulfillment required of 10%. You say, well, that's not that bad. We can still make that happen, right? At least try to get partial fulfillment. Well, the other part is the damage, and the damage also increases incrementally, but incrementally against whatever garrison is there. So it increases, I think, incrementally even from 0% all the way up to 10, and then from 10 to 20 it's doubled, and from 20 to 40 it's doubled again. That means if we're losing 10,000 troops at 10%, we would lose 16 times that amount, or 160,000 troops at 40%. If that math sounds a little odd, it just means that high resistance means a lot of losses. 10,000 soldiers a year is not that big of a deal. 160,000 is pretty brutal. and you can comfortably lose 160,000. That's one of the advantages of putting heavy tanks in there, because even if we can't meet the fulfillment for the heavy tank, that very high hardness, we're actually taking about 10% of what damage we'd otherwise take, and we also have half the manpower, so we're taking significantly less losses than we would have Garrison. The reason I say 10% is because I think the hardness cap is 90%, so we take not 5% of the damage, but we take actually 10% due to that cap. Light tanks takes 20% of what cavalry would take in the same level of population, and so of course light tanks also have less than half the manpower as well. Now, what about Iran? This is where things kind of get most complicated, because as we grew, and we locked down Romania, and then we locked down Iraq, and we're going to lock down Kuwait and Syria. And when I lock down, I mean we're going to commit to putting cavalry down there and with a martial law to keep them under 10%. Iran, nonetheless, at one point looked just like Turkey with that 40%. So how do we deal with them? Well, we deal with them, or I deal with them, by putting a few, maybe in this case it's 9 factories on light tank. I hope you love this production. It's a bit cursed, but basically it means that we're going to be adding light tanks. And the reason I don't have a lot on artillery or infantry or support is because through Lend-Lease, we are meeting those needs comfortably. I'm meeting my infantry needs, my artillery needs, my anti-air, and my support. This way, it's a manpower issue, not an infantry equip. So we're going to put a fair amount on light tanks, and then we're going to make a light tank template, add some military police, and eventually grow it out. And then we're going to select certain states. Now, in this, I'm intentionally showing you after we've been doing this for a while. But the first state we started with was Tehran because of the number of factories. And so with Tehran, we went down and selected it down here, and then we would have selected the light tank garrison, and then we would have selected martial law. And we would have done this before we could meet full fulfillment, or entire fulfillment. Maybe at 50, 100 light tanks, that's enough. We're sending it in there. Because even at partial fulfillment, martial law will start the downward tick of resistance. So instead of being 45, the resistance target might be like 30 or 40, and then as it ticks down, it requires less and less fulfillment. You gotta remember, fulfillment is reduced incrementally, so if it's at 40%, or 45 like Ankara is right now, if we can just get a little bit of fulfillment in there, then the resistance target will reduce down, and then over time resistance will go, and as resistance goes down, fulfillment goes up, even though I'm not adding more tanks, because the required fulfillment, I should say fulfillment percentage goes up because the resistance goes down. When resistance goes from 40 to 20, it only needs half the number of tanks, which means fulfillment continues to increase. And this is a good time to talk a little about fulfillment and what that means. So fulfillment in this case means the number of garrisons, or the type of equipment and manpower we would need to make that target. So in this case, where is this? This is Kerman, excuse me. In Kerman, I'm saying I want heavy tanks and local police. And the game's saying you don't actually have any heavy tanks, and since you don't have any heavy tanks, you have 0 fulfillment, and therefore you get a plus 10% to your resistance, or resistance target. This is extremely painful, and this went into place I think about a month or 2 ago. Merit Paradox made a patch, and they patched this. At one point, this was negative 35%. I think for a large part of the game, it was negative 35% or something else. If you didn't make fulfillment, it would give you military governor for free, but no more. Now, if you don't make fulfillment, it's a plus 10%. So you don't have heavy tanks, you're stuck at that amount. But if you can make even the smallest amount, in this case we have, a fair amount, we've got secret police, we're making 96% fulfillment. In this case, this is a better example. So in this case, I've got the martial law. Martial law would be 60% with full fulfillment or complete fulfillment, but we only have I guess it's 62% fulfillment, or it's 38, actually it's probably 38% fulfillment, and we're still getting the 33% reduction in resistance target. That's a big deal. That's actually a huge deal. That's also why martial law is the preferred prefer default, the garrison law that we want to apply when we start putting light tanks out there, because just the smallest amount of fulfillment will push that number, that +10 to +9, +8. Next thing you know, we're at +5 and then 0, and then before you know it, 100, 200 days later, you're at -33 and you're well on your way. And once we get down into 20% or less, that's when we switch them off into cavalry. Because generally, at this moment, I don't have the manpower, but generally we have the manpower to make that happen, and we don't have to worry about damage that much because a 20% resistance isn't too bad. We want to get down to 10, but at 20% we want to transition. So if Tehran was on light tanks, then I would select Cav. That would free up the light tanks, and then I could find another state that was using heavy tanks and have them select light tanks, which would effectively replace the light tanks in Tehran with Cav, and then it would replace, and then send those light tanks over more or less to the brand new state. So once, let's say, Sistan is a great example. So Sistan's sitting at 20% here. Let's see if I can find him here. System is sitting at 20%. So he's about ready, or this state is about ready to get swapped over to Cav. And then that would free up the tanks, and then we would find someone else, like maybe Yazd, and then we would switch them over to light tanks, if you're following me on that. And then over time, more and more as these light tank resistance fall, more and more of them will be switched over to Cav, and then more of the heavy tanks will be switched over to light tanks, and then 200 days from now or so, all of these will be switched over to Cav, and that will free up the light tanks, and then we can start to go to work on Turkey. And then once Turkey's all switched over, maybe 300 days after that, then we should be done because we have locked down everyone else, so nobody else should be in this on-fire resistance environment. All right, so that is the mechanics, and if that sounds a little bit complicated and a little bit micromanagement, it probably is. I think on your game, depending on how much effort you want to put into this, you could just put light tanks into Iran. Instead of going at the state-by-state level, just say, light tanks, and whatever happens, happens. That's probably fine. Or you could just go heavy tanks for the whole game if that's what you wanted to do. All right, so now we're going to move into the last part, which is the tips and tricks. Tips and tricks. So the biggest one is, and this is what kind of mentioned, that for high hardness areas, you want to use tanks. At least in my experience, I got brutalized in an Iran game. I lost comfortably 1 million manpower in a year by trying to use Cav. I just couldn't keep up. I had like 40, 45 core manpower because I was coring, took the Memphis core focuses. I was core in Cairo and core in parts of Africa. Didn't matter, couldn't keep it up. I hope you have better luck, but yeah, if I couldn't do it with a 40 million core manpower Iran, then we certainly can't do it with Afghanistan or Makumaide or Siberian Tiger, the Tanatuva, those smaller nations. So for high resistance, I want to say, in my opinion, anything over 20%, I would use high hardness. And that's not always the case. When I ran my Mughal run, that's what it is, I think it is, for India, I had 4 million manpower. This number here set up as 4 million. So once I got up to 25, 50,000 infantry weapons, I don't think I used light tanks at all during that game. I mean, what's the point if you've got effectively unlimited manpower and unlimited infantry weapons? I just used infantry cav everywhere, and if we lost troops, I'm sad about it, but that's just fine. But almost everyone else cannot use cav. I don't think cannot use cav for high resistance. The priority is to keep resistance low. Well, by low, I mean 10% or below. What I mean by 10% is that, and let's see if we can find one over here. So in this case, Tehran is currently set for secret police, and he's running, he's got currently about a 15% current strength, and his target is 12. And that's pretty close. I mean, you might say, well, I thought it's supposed to be 10% or less. Shouldn't be go martial law? But that's pretty good, because as he continues down to 12%, he'll increase his fulfillment a little bit, or fulfillment will increase a little bit to the full 30%, and he's already got a negative 11% on compliance, so he'll drop below the 10% and continue dropping as the other areas. One of the things he's suffering from right now is Gilan is suffering from extraordinary high resistance, so he's got a plus 10% on that. So when we finally solve out Gilan, which we will, then that will help out Tehran as well. Alright, now we're going to get to some of the real fun parts. Now, some of you might have seen another guide, there are several out there, that talked about why this is a really bad template. This is the worst template. And they ran our test on it, and by the way, I partially agree, this can be a terrible template. As I pointed out, with high resistance, this is going to, I'm not saying it's going to end your run, but it can make your run extremely painful and may actually end up ending your run, because this is kind of a runaway system here, that once you can't make fulfillment and you get worse and worse and farther behind, the resistance sits up at 10% and you'll never be able to bring it down. Not never is a long term, because play long enough eventually you might, but you'll have a hard time. You'll be potentially disbanding divisions to try to meet fulfillment, but they'll just be gunned down by the resistance, which is sitting at 40%. So from that point of view, yes, using this for high resistance is terrible. There's something else going on with it, and this is a real odd thing, in that even though there's relatively few equipment, there's only 10 bits of support equipment for 2,440 infantry equipment, the way damage is done to garrison disproportionately damages the support equipment. Maybe 100 times more, depending on how your math works, but this should take very few equipment losses. And by the way the game handles damage in general, it's not based on IC cost, but based on the amount of equipment. Whether you have a 3 IC tank or a 30 IC tank, if you take a tank hit, you take damage to a tank hit, it's at the equipment level. The game doesn't say, well, 30 IC, let's take it easy on that tank. No, it will hit the tank for the full 30 IC. So if it's got 10 support equipment, even though those are more expensive than infantry, it would take the hit on the support. But there's so few support. Right, we should expect to see very few support equipment, but we don't. But we actually don't. This template right here actually will take more damage than a single bat cav, than one that looks like this. And by the way, this is the equivalent of a single bat, the way that it scales up. Again, I'll say this takes more than a single bat. And in this game, I've actually got, I've invested into the second level of military police. The first level of military police, the damage, this would take about 20% more IC damage than not having it all. And I'll say that again because it sounds really odd. If you watch another guide and you saw that they suggested this is the worst template ever, yeah, maybe they're right in a sense, because if you just use one cav, you'll take 20% less IC damage because the game overhits support equipment. I think that without going into the theory or my theories on why that is, some of the thoughts is that because even though it's so few, it can't take a fraction of a support equipment. It should take a fraction, like maybe 1/100th of a support equipment when it takes damage, but it has to take rounds up to 1. That's one theory. But in any case, one cav is better than this. I'll say that again. Or somehow just take that military police out is better, except for one thing. First of all, if you're using it for these high resistance, absolutely. But if you're using it for low resistance, then that's actually not so bad, because yeah, it's taken more damage, but it's taken so less damage. If it's sitting at 8%, 7%, 6% resistance, like we're sitting up here, 5%, and this guy's on his way to 2%. This is a, by the way, full fulfillment. So it's a 30% of circuit police. You're not taking any damage. At 2% resistance target, you're truthfully not taking any damage, but you're taking so little that it no longer matters. And at that point, fulfillment is very helpful, because even at a 2% resistance, you still have to meet fulfillment as if you're at 10% resistance. So that alone makes this helpful. But you say, that's not enough, Friendly Cat, because I'm going to spend most of my time, doing at 20% and 15%, or like you're having trouble with Kuwait. Well, this is the real kind of secret of the thing, is that if you look at it again, you may notice that support equipment takes up the extraordinarily small amount of the equipment. One might even say less than 1% of the equipment. I think you could say that. And that means if you don't have support equipment, are you still making 99% of your fulfillment? Yes, you are. Yes, you are, and that has been tested. Yes, you are. And the way that the garrison setup goes, as far as how not rewarding it is, I guess I should say, but whether it gives you the full effect. It will give you the full effect even if you have nothing there, and it appears that you get the full effect of military police even if you don't have any support equipment. For normal military divisions in the field, I don't think it works that way. If you have line artillery but you don't have, support artillery, but you don't have any support artillery here, you don't get the extra soft attack. It doesn't say, well, you're 99% like this. Oh, you don't have any artillery, but you're 99% of the way there using infantry, so we'll give you the soft attack. I don't think it works that way. But for Garrison, it seems like it does. You say, well, good luck with that, Friendly Cat. How am I going to make a bunch of support equipment and not use it? Well, if you're thinking, well, I'll go into the equipment thing and I'll click that off, that does not seem to have any effect. At least in my test, doing this doesn't do anything. The Garrison's like, yeah, we'll still use support equipment. We are going to only use this for the purpose of divisions in the field, but Garrisons still use it. Well, what you can actually do, I'm so sorry, you can actually go into your Recruit and Deploy menu, choose Garrisons as the lowest level, and this is going to use operations because I do want to make sure those collabs are taken care of. And then, but most importantly, reinforcement needs to be right here. And this means that as long as it looks like this, it will only fill garrisons if you've met the support equipment requirements of your troops. So you only have to build support for your troops. Now that does mean this is going to show up here as you are missing the following equipment, 100 support, 200 support, 500 support, 300 support, whatever it is, but it's actually not going to be that high. A couple hundred support, you go, oh no, I'm really bad. But you'll actually have full fulfillment up here. You'll get 100% of the fulfillment. And in this case, you don't see the fulfillment number because you've met the full fulfillment. Down here's a better example. In this case, you have 0% fulfillment. Tehran, we have 92% fulfillment. So if you don't have support equipment, you'll still hit fulfillment. Or more importantly, you could actually make tanks. You could actually not make, in this game, I'm lend-leasing support, but you could say, I'm not going to make any support at all for any of my troops. I'm just going to use troops with support artillery, and I'm not going to worry about engineers or pioneers or recon, and you still could make this work. And in that scenario, this is bonkers good, extraordinarily good, because now you're no longer taking any support loss, so no IC from that, but you also benefit from reduced infantry equipment loss because you do have the increased suppression or the reduced amount of manpower and IC, so you're taking less infantry loss and less manpower loss. So in that case, that's what makes this so good. Now in my game, we're not seeing that because I have 4.6k support equipment. But if I was running a game where I was short on support and I'm like, oh, I guess I have to put like 10 factories or 8 factories on support or 5 or whatever it is, I'll say, no, I'm not going to put it. I'll put 1 or 2. I'll just put enough to feed my army, knowing that the whole game this is going to say, we are missing the following equipment: 100 support, 200 support, 300 support. Of course, if I run a support surplus, they will go into the garrisons, but I can live with that. And that makes this very, very good. Now its brother, I guess, or its sister, its peer, motorized police is even better because you never need to make these. You're not worried about these somehow being produced and falling into the garrison instead of your troops. You can actually make this division, this is the support company. We can't actually see it because I haven't researched it. And then don't make motorized at all. Motorized military police. Don't make the motorcycles. The motorcycles don't serve any purpose in any of the rest of your army, so the only reason you're making for this, so just say forget it. And then you'll get the full benefit of it without ever taking any losses. Now in my games, I almost never get to that research part because I would need a special experimental facility. I don't have any experimental facilities. I won't have any until this run's just about done. But if you were running or doing a run, and there are quite a few achievement runs where you're able to secure partially through the run, you're able to get a military facility somewhere because some of the majors start with them, then I would certainly strongly consider taking this special project, which we of course cannot see, the special project right here, to research what we would need, and then to research the the military engineering vehicles. And then once that special project is complete, I can't say for certain, but I'd likely pick up motorized military police, attach that, to here, or my light tank, which is even better, and then not make any motorcycles at all, and so enjoy the full benefit of motorcycles without using motorcycles. All right, so the last two tips we're going to talk about, I think we might have talked a little bit about martial law. So if you're at a partial fulfillment level, I'd say if you're at 0 fulfillment, you run local police. We run local police because local police has the lowest required garrisons at minus 35%. If you're going to take damage, you might as well take the lowest amount with your heavy tanks. And if you have full fulfillment or nearly full fulfillment, you're going to use whichever one of these, local police, secret police, or martial law, whichever one gets you to 10%. We talked about that. But what about partial police? Partial fulfillment is highly benefited by martial law, which kind of makes sense. If you're like, well, I only need to go down 5 or 10%, local police should work, secret police should work, but martial law, because it's that huge negative 60%, needs very little fulfillment to see that tick come down. Put another way, if it's at half of its fulfillment, you still get the full effect of local secret police. So and I think it scales a little bit better than that. But martial law is what we want to use instead of local or secret police, even if we only want to come down a little bit, even if we're suffering, especially if we're suffering from fulfillment, which sounds kind of counterintuitive because you think local police with its required garrisons of negative 35% would be the preferred if you're suffering from fulfillment, but actually martial law, is the way to go. And the last but not least, if you're like me, you're like slightly overwhelmed by this whole thing. You're like, I just want a garrison and I just want a law that I can just fire for the rest of the game. Honestly, heavy tank and local police is really, really doable. Now it sounds really bad because you're like, oh, I'm going to lose a bunch of factories and stuff. But look, actually Ankara doesn't look too bad. It's still got its 3 mills and 1 civ. Yeah, it's taken some. It's got 2 factories out of compliance. Oh, he's only lost 1 factory. That's not so bad. He's lost 2. Okay, this is pretty bad. The resistance has been active over here, but there's 1. Okay, both of these are damaged. Okay, that's all damaged, but that's actually not so bad. And you say, well, that sounds really bad to lose all these factories. Well, you're taking very little manpower losses, even with the 40% resistance. Compliance is ticking up. Turkey's already made itself up to 18% compliance, and I have not dedicated a single bit of IC to garrison that place, just heavy tanks. That's not so bad. And once we drop really below the 50% resistance, it's kind of smooth sailing. So if you're frustrated, I'd say if you're frustrated by the whole resistance, garrison, micromanagement, and you looked at Iran, you're like, that looks like the most gnarly thing, unhappy thing I would ever want to do. You could probably go local police with heavy tanks, and then for the whole game if you wanted to, or once you had some manpower and IC, then you could go calves and never do the light tank game, or make some light tanks and just add a few. But definitely heavy tank and local police is very valid. Well, I hope this was very helpful, or at least maybe a little bit helpful. Hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to leave down below. If there's something I missed or maybe misstated, or you've got questions, I'm here for you. Anyway, thank you very much, and I hope you have a great day.